The division we see in America today, explained. In this episode, I'm continuing the tale of the 60s and 70s and how the political chaos in America on both sides gave the worst president and the worst man the biggest electoral landslide of the modern era. How did America become so brainwashed against our own people? And why? The division and damage done by the Republicans following the Barry Goldwater loss in 1964 bred the atmosphere of pro-corporate classism that led to Citizens United. But all that had to have help. For that help, conservatives conspired to organize, align, and unite for their greater interests, while the Democrats couldn't survive, literally. Kennedy, then Kennedy. The 1968 election almost certainly would have swung toward Bobby Kennedy, but, well, history. The Democrats were left in shambles and Republicans were poised for the, poor pun intended, kill. Vietnam, civil unrest, protests. In this episode, it's leading to Nixon and how he manipulated American patriotism into the nationalism Reagan would exploit for fascism, gaslighting the American people to turn on each other, fostering the division we see today. It's all leading up to the finale where I'll detail the parallel conspiracy by our enemies to infiltrate our society and exploit our narcissism, pushing us to our limits, shaking us up like a carbonated beverage. They don't have to destroy us. They're just waiting for us to destroy ourselves. Then they just have to come in and play hero and save us from ourselves. This episode is about the grand distraction of America's two parties setting the stage for the attack we never saw coming. And welcome to the podcast. In 1960, Eisenhower had beaten a less charming and less camera-friendly candidate he lost to Kennedy. I've covered how the Civil Rights Act played into the assassination a little in earlier episodes, but when Kennedy got shot in 1963, Goldwater was rocked by the loss. Mostly because he prepped for a showdown against JFK in 1964, Goldwater didn't like Lyndon Johnson personally. He was shook by the tragedy. He wasn't his usual self. That and his refusal to vote for the Civil Rights Act cost him that election. The 1964 electoral map looked almost identical to some maps of America's other presidential elections. The South, for example, up to this election, was all Democratic presidential party politics. Even in 1928, as the Great Depression annihilated many, and Republicans ignored the South's pleas for help, the Democrats of the early 20th century were still racist enough the South voters would support them in hopes of assistance. For the next 20 years, the South would go blue for presidents, win or lose. Well, in 1948, remember Henry A. Wallace was an independent on the progressive ticket, but he wasn't a third party. Wallace came in fourth and took 0 states with his anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-corruption, and pro-working class rhetoric. In fact, the third party wasn't the progressives in 1948. Instead, the States' Rights Democratic Party won just over 11,000 more votes than Wallace with their candidate, South Carolina Grand Wizard Strom Thurmond. Thurmond took his home state, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, along with gaining 1 electoral vote in my state of Tennessee. After that, the electoral maps for presidential elections would return to their mostly red with South blue motif we've been so used to outside of World Wars I and II. Truman wasn't expected to win in 1948 and overcame a split in his party to defeat the Republicans, who were projected to win by, well, everybody. You've seen the famous picture of Truman holding the newspaper that says Dewey wins. But America wanted to keep what we had going. The map would almost invert 4 years later, with Truman not seeking re-election and Eisenhower middle-of-the-roading America into a powerhouse near sweep of the states. Except the South. The South, which stayed Democratic. Eisenhower couldn't convince the Southern Democrats to switch over enough mass to flip, so the Deep South stayed blue. What would it take to convince them? Republicans saw a playbook of success with Strom Thurmond. Thurmond was wildly popular among one of the most passionate and fervent groups in this country. Uneducated, white, radicalized racists. For most of America's history, since the mid-1800s at least, the quiet part out loud was getting them to vote for you without campaigning openly to them. Thurman campaigned openly to them in 1948. In fact, many of these voters won't vote if they don't feel their concerns are being heard. And when you need votes and you don't care where and how you get them, it's all a numbers game. Republicans were watching. The 1960 election was another we don't consider because America is a two-party system. However, there was a distinct split in the Democratic Party in 1960, with Harry Byrd of Virginia challenging Kennedy not for the primary, but for the presidency in the general. Byrd was a conservative Democrat and segregationist, a holdover from the Confederacy, who condemned the Supreme Court's decision on Brown v. Board of Education and a staunch opposer of civil rights. He was also nominated to run as either president or vice president by the States' Rights Party, the Constitution Party, and the America First Party. That kind of conservative Democrat. He took Alabama and Mississippi in 1960, but couldn't draw enough to help Nixon beat JFK. His perspective was undoubtedly skewed by his legacy of corrupt influence peddling over his 50-year political career where he managed to control Virginia's political landscape. Republicans were watching, and now, so was Ronald Reagan. Lyndon Johnson succeeded Kennedy officially in 1964, and that electoral college map would only show Goldwater red for his home state of Arizona and the Deep South. Republicans were trying to pick up the pieces of their party's losses. Remember, Goldwater's ultra-conservative faction weren't fans of Eisenhower, so the perceived oppression here goes back to the early 1930s. This side of conservatism in the mid-60s had felt victimized and underrepresented now for over 3 decades. The next election was the Dixiecrat election, where Republicans kept South Carolina and picked up most of the country for Nixon, except the Northeast, Texas, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington State. Arkansas, which was blue for LBJ in 1964, fell to the white supremacist George C. Wallace in 1968. Reagan knew Nixon wouldn't hold the South and wanted to unofficially throw his hat into the ring. It still didn't land. But still, the waters were tested, and through Strom Thurmond, Harry Byrd, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, and now George C. Wallace, Ronald Reagan and the conservative establishment in America could Goldilocks the narrative, the rhetoric, the platform, and the president to appeal to the masses simply by selling their souls for a price of a gigantic dog whistle. Nixon won, and won big in 1968 through some ethically questionable, shady tactics. Tricky Dick, after all. But the 1972 election was a mandate America hadn't seen since Roosevelt's second term. And for perspective, World War II, Vietnam, similar war culture, similar economies, Roosevelt lost Maine and Vermont. Nixon only lost Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Granted populations, electors, etc., but FDR, the man whose New Deal saved America, and Nixon swept more states. A near clean sweep of the country's states voted for Nixon in the second biggest electoral college victory of the two-party system, by 5. Nixon. To consider that. The modern era's greatest uniter of America was Dick. Richard Nixon had managed to do something no leader had done in the modern era. How? 1968 now, that made perfect sense. We were engaged in military action. America was reeling from the cultural repercussions of the blowback and Civil Rights Act. Look, that alone was enough for a presidential party flip. Better or worse, it was different. Change makes us uncomfortable, even if that change benefits us. So the age-old, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" stump speech call to action thing is really enough psychologically given the context of the period. Enough for most Americans to go, "I don't really like this restaurant, can we try something new next time?" Then factor in 1968's field, no incumbent, even more justification of what I just said. You're not firing anybody? This is a clean reset? A mulligan? It's even more likely to go either way. Maybe more likely under those given circumstances to flip parties. But that's the Dixiecrat election. So you had Democrat Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, and of course, former Democrat, Southern Democrat, George Wallace, running on the American independent ticket. It wasn't close, even without George Wallace. However, without George Wallace, it would have been an even bigger landslide. Those voters frustrated by the Democrats flocked to their grand wizard because he was on a platform shouting hate speech and toxic rhetoric, pandering to the lowest intellectual and ethical denominators of society. But get this right. Between Humphrey and Nixon, Nixon's rhetoric was closer to George Wallace's. Nixon's platform was easier to swallow than Humphrey's and the Democrats. There isn't a lot of argument to be made that in 1968, Dixiecrats would have gone blue no matter who. So what did Richard Nixon do in those first few years of his first term to cement a re-election in 1972 by that margin? This is going to piss a lot of you off, but give me a few minutes to really set the stage. Vietnam. Just like in 1944, America wasn't changing course in the middle of a war, especially when that war was nearing an inevitable end. Much less to McGovern, but we should have. South Dakota's George McGovern, the name alone, wasn't only against the Vietnam War, he was anti-war. McGovern was more progressive-leaning than the party had been in some time. He was not only a supporter of Henry A. Wallace, but he was also cut from the same cloth. A farm boy from the heartland who fought relentlessly for the agriculture industry of America, the farmer. Now, McGovern lost. No spoilers. That's history. But McGovern lost and America lost. America lost again, like America lost with Wallace in 44 and 48. McGovern was a compassionate man, a thinker, a quiet, deliberate man. McGovern ran meager campaigns early in his career, not giving way to bloated indulgences. He won on clearly articulated ideas and relating to the people he met face to face. He wasn't just pro-labor, pro-working class. McGovern, like Henry A. Wallace, like other pro-farm progressives like me, recognized that the American economy didn't work without free labor, and that the American agricultural industry was affected most by the end of slave labor. They recognized America's agricultural industry. Our farms need to be the backbone of our economy because that is the real currency on this planet. And that industry was most affected, crushed by the abolition of slave labor in America. That was the great sacrifice for doing the right thing, cutting into profits. This fight was to save American agriculture and save America, to find ways to make it work with a paid workforce. In fact, if you look out who's in the fields and factories today, you'll see exactly what I mean. We never truly abolished it. We just changed the name, started paying a little under the table. Our business model was written in fraud. We fudged the numbers. We didn't factor in the overhead of wages. McGovern's platform, his personal career platform, was built around aiding, if not solving, world peace and world hunger. Still, he struggled once he ascended to the U.S. Senate. The Boys Club didn't like him because he didn't play their game. He wasn't social with them. McGovern kept to himself like Henry Wallace did. He wasn't one of them. He turned down opportunities for power, prestige, and influence. That's not what George McGovern was there to do. He was there to fight for we the people. To, wait for it, govern. Early in his pre-political career, McGovern had vocalized support for China joining the United Nations. That and his pro-Henry Wallace ideals gave cannon fodder to the right. When he ran for the House in 1956, his Republican opponent, you guessed it, accused McGovern of communist sympathizing. McGovern fired back that he despised communism. He ended up winning. The Vietnam War divided America in many ways for a very long time. McGovern gave a speech on the Senate floor in 1963 that encapsulated the divide. Quote, "The current dilemma in Vietnam is a clear demonstration of the limitations of military power." He criticized that our involvement in policy in the war, quote, "is a policy of moral debacle and political defeat." He went on to say, quote, "The trap we have fallen into there will haunt us in every corner of this revolutionary world if we do not properly appraise its lessons." This was 6 years before the climax of America's over 2 decades-long involvement in Vietnam. Sometimes, in our culture, we focus so much on the military story that the political story gets lost. Because the military story has a face, a human face, a traumatized, scarred human face we don't dare call into question. The political story is to blame for that, and when some realize that there's no going back, those poems and songs, the flags, they mean something different. Those who've seen the firsthand effects of war, like McGovern did when he visited VA hospitals, wounded soldiers. Republicans, on the other hand, had Nixon. There was an opportunity there to move in on the Republicans and capitalize on the swelling social friction. The Democrats had led the nation for most of the last half century. What was good out of America was planted by Democrats. How could they lose? Nixon was quite possibly the worst candidate, very flawed, and not a good representation for anyone but the stereotype of a sleazy, womanizing lawyer character who eventually gets pushed down an elevator shaft in a TV show. McGovern would have been a shift back to working class values and working on Americans. McGovern's focus wasn't on war, but ending it, and ending the need for it. Bigger picture stuff. He wasn't perfect, but he had his flaws. McGovern wasn't your typical Democrat either. In the 1968 election, it wasn't that Lyndon Johnson honorably stepped aside. Nobody wanted the man to be president anymore except Lyndon Johnson. And the important perspective is that there was a dump Johnson movement within the Democratic Party that was looking for literally anybody to run against him. There were Democrats who were terrified of George Wallace's influence on the party, the platform, and the people. Nixon wasn't much better. It was terrifying for many. A lesser of three evils where the one is a no-brainer on paper. The entire Democratic primary of this election, 68, was chaotic and sort of a hot potato game of who wants to inherit the shit show. Nobody seemed to want to run against the incumbent's record, a failed president from their own party, and then take what would amount to be a losing job before you even start. The Dump Johnson movement wanted Bobby Kennedy and sought some other interest, with George McGovern toward the top of that list. Considering it a career risk, McGovern would initially decline to run for president in 1968. Minnesota's Eugene McCarthy, who was an anti-war Democrat, agreed to be the candidate to primary the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson. McCarthy's criticisms of Johnson were well known. Hippies shaved their beards, cut their hair to campaign for him. He had a lot of support. He wasn't alone in that anti-war sentiment either. Robert Kennedy, who initially declined entering, then threw his hat into the ring. With that, and the anti-LBJ sentiment growing nationwide, Johnson's hopes of re-election were gone. There was no way the wildly unpopular former vice president to John F. Kennedy would beat the dead man's brother, for crying out loud. McCarthy and Kennedy were both on the same side of the Democratic Party, but neither would cede. Hubert Humphrey was the Democrats' candidate that was going to continue the war and try to work our way out of the mess. It wasn't that anti-war people didn't like McCarthy, it's that many felt Kennedy had the intangibles to win the general election. He was a Kennedy. This is where it gets nasty, but showcases the problematic ideals of even Democrats back then. Once Lyndon Johnson was out, McCarthy and Kennedy went after each other like attack dogs, with Humphrey sort of just watching it unfold. Kennedy's ambitions weren't much different than his brother's, but it was a debate on national television that really allowed Kennedy to the momentum he needed. McCarthy made comments that under certain conditions, he would accept communists in South Vietnam's government, and that the solution to the urban problem in America was the relocation of inner-city black people. Now, I can talk my way out of these issues in or out, just as any politician or bullshit slinger could. But Kennedy went for the, pardon the pun, the headshot. Kennedy played the narrative as McCarthy being, surprise, a communist sympathizer, and then played the race card, spreading propaganda that McCarthy's plan was to bus tens of thousands of poor inner-city African Americans into predominantly white areas. It was 1968. Hard to argue the Kennedys weren't a little racist. Jack wouldn't even walk a little girl into a desegregated school, after all. Where does George McGovern come into play? The progressive McGovern initially liked Kennedy as a candidate, and when he declined the offer to jump in the race, McGovern felt Kennedy was a better option than Eugene McCarthy. He didn't openly campaign for either man, staying publicly neutral, as his neighboring state, Minnesota, was where McCarthy was from. McGovern and Kennedy were close. In fact, one of the last conversations Robert Kennedy would ever have would be a phone call with George McGovern moments before Sirhan assassinated the younger Kennedy. Kennedy's death rattled McGovern to the core. He lost a dear friend. Eugene McCarthy's response wasn't as compassionate. It's reported by David Greenberg in a 2008 Slate article that McCarthy said that Kennedy was, quote, demagoguing to the last, and that he, quote, brought it on himself with his stance on supporting Israel. Kennedy had won the pivotal California primary and was almost assured the nomination. He was shot immediately after. The Democrats in 1968 were left in shambles, tearing each other apart for control to salvage the primary. Ultimately, whatever clout Johnson earned or burned with the Civil Rights Act was gone with his absolute disastrous handling of Vietnam. His jumping back into the race after having dropped out after another Kennedy was shot would be complicated. That's when the party first turned to George McGovern. Hubert Humphrey wasn't the party's choice, and now Eugene McCarthy's blind hubris overshadowed his anti-war commitment. Kennedy was anti-war, and now he was gone. Democrats needed an anti-war candidate, and for that, they turned to Kennedy's close mate, McGovern, to challenge Humphrey. All the while, Nixon is beating the drum on his campaign trail, and George C. Wallace is holding white supremacist hate rallies on his. Just weeks before the Democratic convention, McGovern announced his bid, but it seemed too late. Why did he wait so long? He was devastated by the loss of his dear friend. Some issues in his personal life concerning his daughter's troubles, legal issues stemming from a marijuana arrest, as well as his lean toward the center, showing less than favorable response to his candidacy, it all caused McGovern to deliberate on whether to change his mind and enter the race. Humphrey was the leader, and McCarthy kept getting in his own way, putting his foot in his mouth over and over again. Finally, at the convention, McCarthy seemed to be the last choice, until McGovern decided to suck boot too. The 1968 convention, it was volatile inside and out. McGovern took the controversial stand as demonstrators protested outside, calling the Chicago police's response to that action police brutality. I put a sticky note here because it'll come up later. The Democrats were waking up, but they weren't quite yet woke. After blasting the cops, the Democrats wouldn't touch McGovern at the 68 convention. Humphrey won big. The primary. That was 1968. Nixon won the general. But in 1972, the Democrats turned to McGovern, the progressive anti-war, apparently anti-police brutality candidate. Even though the war was heading in an inevitable end, McGovern felt strongly that only a change in administration would end that election's primary issue, the Vietnam conflict, once and for all, save America from the disastrous ripple effects. McGovern again had to contend with Hubert Humphrey, but dispatched him and other challengers throughout a difficult primary that was rife with dirty politics from Nixon and his own Democratic Party challengers. McGovern was too progressive for many in the party, something we've heard all too often. However, he cemented his position at the top of the party, and at the 1972 convention, which also opened the door for a discussion on the party's platform. McGovern's influence would lead the push of the Democrats further left than they dare to go since Roosevelt. In fact, it might be argued ever, since Roosevelt did a lot of what he did without getting party permission. The seeds of the Democrats' division were planted with the more liberal and progressive side and the more conservative middle-of-the-roaders. What can be most easily explained as Republicans who didn't want to be racists anymore voted Democrat, but only if their candidate wasn't too far left. They're still in the party today, screwing things up. McGovern had his issues campaigning and selling his message of drastic cuts to military spending and basically stimulus payments to the people, amnesty for draft evaders, and his stance on the war on drugs, among other things. The 72 convention was a divisive disaster. Southern Democrats did not want McGovern, and just like with Johnson, an anybody but McGovern coalition started. While McGovern overcame the objections, even those by the remaining conservative Southern Democrats, he won the nomination early at the convention. Still, with the progressives finally getting a win, and between the small number of Dixiecrat holdovers, most of whom would flee right by the end of the decade, and the more conservative but less racist Democrats, the party was divided. Reluctant to accept a president who would take the party further left, The Democrats negotiated amongst themselves for power and influence. McGovern's ideals came out on top, but there was only one issue. Kennedy was the most likely candidate. Nobody after Kennedy was the real frontrunner, and so there wasn't much talk of who would be number two because no one could agree on number one. Vice president? Yeah, they forgot completely about that. Egos aside, a McGovern and Humphrey ticket would make sense. Everybody on the left wins, right? Of course not. McGovern wanted Ted Kennedy to be his running mate, but Teddy surprisingly declined. In fact, many people turned down McGovern's offer to run in his Veep. Settling for Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton, the convention devolved into an utter shit show, going on till the wee hours of the morning. McGovern's nomination speech aired at 3 a.m. East Coast. The Democrats, again, just couldn't get it together. They wouldn't learn either, as we already found out. The issue is, with all that shit show, no one bothered to look into Eagleton whatsoever. Had they would have learned he wasn't well. Remember when I spoke about mental illness in the last episode? Eagleton had what we now know as bipolar II disorder. However, in the early 1970s, hearing someone being hospitalized for nerves and depression and getting electroshock for it sounded, well. McGovern, who struggled with mental issues with his daughter, stood by Eagleton at first. 1,000% he boasted. However, further vetting, negative press, and discussing the issue with professional mental health experts, McGovern eventually accepted Eagleton's offer to step down amidst concerns the stress of the job might be too much for him. A pivotal moment in mental health and political science. That's the only time it ever happened in history where a vice presidential candidate was pushed off the ticket, and done so by saying his mental health was a handicap. What did that say to America? Probably best not to talk about that. After that, McGovern still wanted Ted Kennedy to be his running mate, but Teddy, to no one's surprise this time, declined. In fact, many people turned down McGovern's offer to run as his Veep, including Hubert Humphrey. The Kennedy story doesn't end with Ted saying no. The McGovern's Veep would eventually be Sergeant Shriver, Maria's dad. It's not a title, it's his name. Jack, Bobby, Ted's brother-in-law, married to their sister Eunice. What is it with these people? Back then, when it came to mental issues, most wouldn't admit it, but most knew someone like Eagleton. We all do now. The science and social acceptability have improved a little since then. It wasn't like Americans couldn't relate. The issue was, initially, George McGovern said he stood by Eagleton 1,000%, then he didn't stand by Eagleton at all. If America was going to go for a liar, they already had one in Nixon. The 1972 general election was unique. Nixon hardly hit the campaign trail. One might argue Nixon knew the outcome of the election before anyone. It's almost like he overheard McGovern's entire campaign strategy, am I right? Still, Nixon rode the approval rating backs of talks with China, visits with China and the Soviet Union, urging that peace in Vietnam was right around the corner. Don't rock the boat. Meanwhile, Nixon and the Republicans' rhetoric against McGovern was insinuating that he was soft on the war and that he would do anything, sacrifice anything, compromise anything to end the war, even if it meant sacrificing America's honor. Nixon swept almost everything in a dominating victory for conservatives in 1972, and yes, McGovern and the Democrats all but handed him the mandate. But there was one incident in 1970 that influenced that landslide more than almost anything else here at home. The issue is, Republicans don't really know nuance. It seemed they saw the mandate without any of the reasons behind it. Convinced most of America longed for better days of our traditional ways, there became a movement to make America again what it used to be. Great. And Nixon would manipulate America's blue-collar backbone to do it. Goldwater's loss was something Republicans wouldn't tolerate again. The fact that Goldwater won the nomination over more reasonable candidates and that the people just didn't gravitate to his rhetoric was a lesson Republicans would have to learn the hard way. They could change the rhetoric and platform of the party to better suit the tenor of the public, or they could influence and manipulate the voters to lower their standards. The American Legislative Exchange Council, formed in 1973 as a response to the sinking of the conservative ship for the sole purpose of influencing elections, legislation, and pushing America farther right than we'd ever been as a nation. In fact, after the shame of Watergate, where Nixon was caught illegally spying on George McGovern's campaign, the ALEC was founded to slap a new coat of paint on that old conservative, anti-working class, white supremacist platform. The Conservative Caucus of State Legislators rebranded themselves to take the dirty C word out. However, ALEC's founders had ties to a future president worth mentioning. Paul Weyrich, whose Heritage Foundation would be the think tank that used Reagan's presidency to push forth a more conservative agenda for America. Lou Barnett, Reagan's national political director of his fundraising PAC. Henry Hyde, Reagan loyalist and a staunch pro-lifer and anti-abortionist congressman whose scandals outnumbered his accomplishments. Now, with these men working together under various different groups and organizations, learning from the mistakes of conservatives after Goldwater, the playbook was being written. Republicans just delivered a mandate of an election in 1972, but did so through the most corrupt means by the most corrupt president to date. Then they got caught, and while they stayed in power, the legitimacy of the party, their policy, and their hold on America was slipping. All they needed was the Democrats to fumble the ball. A 2013 article in Huffington Post by Shadi Ashtari notes that in the 1980s, ALEC fought against America interviewing in South Africa to push them to dismantle apartheid. They've been behind the anti-LGBTQ narratives on child grooming and pedophilia, but they've also fought against environmental regulations, voter legislation, workers' rights, union rights, fighting against regulation and taxation. Also, a huge part of their platform is opposition to gun control legislation. The National Rifle Association, or NRA, was once an organization that promoted education about guns and gun legislation. It wasn't a political entity, at least not a partisan political entity, until the 1970s. Before the Gun Control Act of 1968, the NRA was mostly about hunters and shooters. The NRA's base and focus shifted toward the mid-1970s, with the Institute for Legislative Action and Political Victory Fund being launched by the organization to recruit and compel conservatives in Congress to vote in their favor. There was a split in the NRA between conservatives, those who wanted the Second Amendment upheld as it was intended and defined, and extremists who wanted to rewrite it to their liking and unwind gun control legislation passed in the first half of the 20th century. Basically, some unhinged sociopathic gun nuts took control of the NRA because they liked guns a lot and they didn't like the rules on guns. So they infiltrated the NRA in what amounts to a hostile business takeover and took it from an organization dedicated to educating about guns, gun issues and safety and pushing for gun control legislation to a fascist lobbying special interest group with political donations and influence compromising our elections across the country and world because American guns are sold everywhere by Reagan. In 1871, the organization was founded primarily to encourage Americans to learn how to shoot better and safer, because they recognized that guns kill people. And the only two ways to ensure people don't die is to ban guns altogether or teach people how to be responsible with them. By 1998, the NRA's Political Victory Fund, which is as old as I am, ranked as one of the largest congressional campaign donors. In 2016, nearly $500 million was spent on political action. That's actually not counting the NRA's Political Action Committee spending. They don't have to report. What other group has this much power and influence over our society and the legislation? This is the story of the shifting of the Republican Party to far-right extreme fascism, and the Democrats who stood by and let it happen. This is the story of gaslighting and manipulation, and the deliberate dumbing down and numbing down of America. Sadly, it's all about money. White supremacy too, of course. This is America, but mostly money. We've been sold out, but we just don't care, which is what they wanted all along. So, how how on earth did a group like ALEC even form, and how did the NRA rise to power and make such a complete turn from their origins? How in the world did Richard Nixon issue the most sweeping mandate in electoral politics in American history? War has always divided America, without that ooh-rah nationalism. After World War I, we were done. World War II was a necessary evil to stop an unnecessary evil. After that, America wasn't too keen on sending our boys to another war. Then Korea. Vietnam was different. We were involved for 2 decades, and the sentiment that your values of patriotism, pride, and citizenship were centered around at very least not disgracing America by voicing opposition to the war was something the younger generation wasn't swallowing. By 1970, America's involvement in the war was growing, and the vocal opposition was swelling into protests on college campuses around the country. Young students who would be most affected by the ripple effects of this war, as well as the non-consensual forced servitude of the draft, would take a stand against the United States military establishment and demand action. On April 30th, Nixon announced the war would expand into Cambodia. On May 1st, students around the country staged a massive walkout of classrooms and schools, among other forms of protest. This was before the internet, so appreciate the mass-level organization of this. Sometimes protests devolve into violence. In those cases, most of the time, it's because of an outside agitator, or the protesters simply aren't heard and feel further oppressed by protesting than they did before. In the case of the January 6th Republican insurrection, many deniers will claim the FBI started it or that cops let them into the Capitol. While January 6th hasn't proven to be an example, there have been many examples of events in our history being exploited or escalated by bad actors for the sake of hurting the protesting group's image. In Ohio, at Kent State University on May 2nd, student protesters burned the ROTC building. 2 days later, in the middle of a week-long protest, National Guardsmen murdered 4 students and injured 10 others. Following the news, more than 4 million students nationwide would protest, some of the protests turning violent. Across the country, hundreds of campuses of all kinds were shut down because of these protests. By the end of the student strike of 1970, millions of students would protest military bases, college ROTC centers, and nationwide clashes with law enforcement and military in America. Marches in Washington and other major cities caught worldwide attention. One protest in New York City occurred on the final day of the week-long action. On Friday, May 8, 1970, nearly 1,000 anti-war protesters gathered around Wall Street in Manhattan demanding peace. Just as those students walked out of their classrooms, close to 400 construction workers and nearly 800 office workers walked off their jobs too. It was almost a beautiful, unifying, buy-the-world-a-Coke moment. Except that those construction workers and office workers showed up to attack those anti-war, peace-demanding protesters. The people who showed up to protest the National Guard murdering 4 students got beaten and assaulted by hundreds of pro-Nixon, pro-war, patriotic thugs carrying American flags and chanting things like "America, love it or leave it," and other divisive, hateful, anti-American nationalist rhetoric. In the 3 hours of chaos that ensued, 20,000 people flooded the streets of Lower Manhattan, throwing punches and support one way or the other. Close to 100 people were hurt, including cops. Of the 6 arrested, only 1 was a construction worker agitator. Historically, May 8, 1970 is called Bloody Friday. Americans won't learn much about that in textbooks. Why? Richard Nixon invited the leaders of the construction worker counter-protest to the White House, and when they presented Nixon with his own hard hat, he accepted it with a big smile, knowing his strategy of turning American anti-war, anti-Nixon sentiments around to blaming the hippie, pot-smoking protesters worked. That, combined with the anti-protest propaganda images of soldiers getting condemned, ridiculed, or otherwise disrespected upon return home, quickly forced many in America to consider that a vote against Nixon was a vote for chaos. A vote against Nixon was a vote against America. Nixon's law and order agenda, the war on drugs, and his plan to keep civil order resonated with many. fearful of the generation that might inherit America and the disaster their hippie wokeness might bring. And, just like that, Americans were gaslit and conditioned that hardworking Americans were patriots, and those filthy, commie, protesting hippies were an enemy to the state and public nuisance. This would lay the groundwork for much of the Republican strategy of targeting environmental activists as extremists through propaganda, while ignoring the very, very white elephant in the room: Christo-fascist, white supremacist domestic terrorists. In fact, this strategy of narcissism, gaslighting, and dictating the narrative despite the facts, promoting propaganda to persuade the perspective of the proletariat, to sway the working class against their better interests, and to get we the people to stop talking about the thing the narcissists in charge don't want us to talk about to each other, instead attacking each other. Consider the 2000 election, which we really can't talk about anymore thanks to the most recent claims of fraudulent elections by the right. Now we no longer get to discuss the actual corruption of 2000, which is how they wanted it. Number 14 on Dr. Britt's checklist if you're still keeping score. We will at the end of this episode, I promise. In fact, it's that sort of beaten down hopelessness of nothing surprises us anymore, and I'm just so exhausted with politics that beats us. We aren't paying attention because we just can't anymore. It's all out of our control, and it has been for so long we just let it happen. We go with the flow until we're flushed down the sewer. You can say the 2000 election should have gone for Gore, but after all, what are you going to do about it? But while the left tried to play nice for the sake of unity over divisiveness, the divisiveness of holding corruption accountable, the right was reading out of the playbook of the 1950s all over again. When the people start getting wise to what's happening around them, distractamundo! Just like when we started to discuss the threat of Christo-fascist, right-wing, white supremacist, domestic terrorist organizations, America's focus quickly turned to the towers that fell to... Wait, which country did that to us again? It was all part of the plan. This isn't to say that these events and more were the result of malicious outsiders manipulating us, or inside jobs, but that these events, as they happened, were certainly manipulated as they went on, capitalized on after they happened, for the purpose of corruption, manipulation, and or destroying America. That was their plan all along. No, not Republicans, you silly gooses. Republicans have been caught up in their own hubris and hunger for power for too long. They've turned the blind eye to the snake that's bit them. No. The Republicans have been playing their own game, thinking they're playing their foreign enemies, but secretly holding the upper hand all along. Except that foreign enemy watched the American movies and then saw America elect a movie star president. Face it, the writers for America suck, and this show is predictable. Those who wish to destroy us saw our every move coming long before we did. Republicans played the game for power, using dark forces to manipulate, control, and hoard wealth. For Republicans, it's been about taking America back to a time when white, straight Talibangelicals can go to Walmart and not have to see dudes with fingernail polish. They want America to go back to a time when the people that make them uncomfortable feel too uncomfortable to go out in public and make conservatives feel uncomfortable. Republicans played it as Republican versus Democrat, but their tactics only served to create a socio-cultural vulnerability, a chink in our armor, a crack in the glass, that would be so easily exploited to rot us from the core. And we let it happen. This plan. Whose plan? When our military can't be defeated and our economy is too vital to the world as a whole to fail. And our culture has permeated the globe, corrupting almost every people it's encountered. And when the corruption in our own government is so obvious, it's so... Well, the art of war doesn't always have to apply to the battlefield. For this war, one against America, many would unite to take us down from within. If they couldn't destroy America at war or in commerce, they conspired to use the nuclear option. Cancer. Let America destroy themselves from within, brother against brother, because this raw nationalism worked in the 50s and 60s. It made America appear strong when we were just a stiff, superficial cardboard cutout of a country who acted tough. Reagan saw that firsthand, and it changed him. He was just a stiff, superficial cardboard cutout of a man who could act tough. But eventually, the act gives way and people see through it, as many Americans did. And those protests from the 50s and 60s grew exponentially in the 70s. But that nationalism also gave way to the sentiment of entitlement and us versus the world attitudes that are fed by racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and the worst of human nature. No spies were needed this time. America was online. It was the 80s and on. All they needed were spies like us. This is the story of how American fascism became normalized in our culture. What it took for America, within a century of Hitler, to get to the point where actual Nazis march freely through our streets, living and coexisting in our communities, terrorizing Americans with swastikas, hate speech, and loud and proud agendas, which include the eradication of entire groups of human beings. Umberto Eco's 14 Characteristics of Fascism is an in-depth analysis of what influences those ideological extreme regimes of division and oppression. However, I often refer most people to Dr. Lawrence Britt's list, which is much more digestible for the average person. Both lists are similar. Let's run down Dr. Britt's list. First is a powerful and continuing nationalism. America succumbed to that during the Red Scare of communism, which wasn't necessarily even about the economic theory of communism, as it was a political war against authoritarian regimes that misused, abused, and exploited the economic theory of communism, using it to oppress its people rather than giving its people the power communism, by design, was intended to do. They did so because successful communism contradicts capitalism. In fact, communism, by some perspectives, might be an admonishment of capitalism. Community versus capital, to the root words. In order to get people to dislike the enemy, they had to be very different. Godless Russian commies, right? Even though Orthodox Christianity is the predominant religion. We bought the narrative. We choked down their economy because it invalidated ours, and while every form of government and economic theory is subject to corruption, we highlighted the corruption in the governments around the globe that governed through force and weren't corporate capitalists. We had the stereotypes of Russians not having any toilet paper or blue jeans, empty store shelves, but we really don't consider why. It's complicated, but how many of us even ask? I'm not taking a side on anything other than the point that we are a global economy and becoming a global culture. What was the British Empire of the pre-20th century is now American colonialism. We are the new big bad. The leopard never changed its spots or color. But for that to work, they had to exploit our patriotic feels. Working hard had to be an American value. Loyalty to your boss had to be an American value. Suspicion of the government, the other party, of course, was an American value. Supporting the troops without question was an American value. We'll come back to that. It's number 4. Pushing the nationalist narrative is what America does best. It's what Republicans decided to double down on in the mid-1950s. We're 1 for 14 so far. At number 2 on Dr. Britt's Characteristics of Fascism is disdain for the recognition of human rights. When we say Black Lives Matter, we barely get it out before someone who looks like me but has a snake coiled up on their shirt will shout, "All lives matter," or "Blue lives matter," or something else. That's today. Imagine the 1950s, before the Civil Rights Act. America's been fighting this battle since the first white people landed here. However, once the big switch happened and Reagan acknowledged the Democratic Party had left him behind because the quiet part he didn't say was that they were pushing the Civil Rights Act through. Wasn't quite that simple. But the truth is, while most people in Congress voted to pass the act, this wasn't because they just came around to finally believing that all men are created equal. There was significant pressure socially, both sides, globally, for our deplorable treatment of minorities in this country. The world had seen what Adolf Hitler did to not just Jews, but everyone he wanted to exterminate. That was a lot of people. We forget that. Hitler's ideals and tactics were inhumane and just evil. Misguided doesn't do the man justice. He was completely and utterly insane, a madman, a calculated, very smart madman. And there are people in this country who respect him. We have to know that, even if it scares us. By the mid-20th century, the world and our own people were starting to see that we weren't much different. In fact, Asian internment camps, segregation, the patriarchal abuses of women, Jim Crow, and our very Nazi-like treatment of the LGBTQ community, along with the continuing push of religion into our public normalized narrative, exposed America for what we were: performative playboys persecuting people for profit. We're 2 for 14. This isn't a list you want to be on a streak for. Number 3, Dr. Lawrence Britt warns us about being narcissists, blaming other people for our problems. Britt words it as identification of enemies or scapegoats as a unifying cause. Build the Wall, All Lives Matter, the BLM riots of 2020, Occupy Wall Street, liberals, I can keep going all the way back to the Hard Hat Riot, even further to the anti-communist and anti-labor rhetoric, demonizing unions. All this stuff crosses over to others on the list too. Tell me who rallies behind a brown bad guy better than America. And since 2008, it's been brutally obvious that some people, Republicans, will oppose someone simply because they're a minority, not like them, without understanding that even if that's not problematic, which it almost always is, how they feel about it is exactly how most Americans feel every time another old white man is elected. As the Democrats have stepped back from America's bigotry and problematic past, not doing much to fix it, mind you, but certainly making it clear that the left is the place for tolerance for all, intolerance for intolerance, the right has pulled just as hard the other direction. Those caught in the middle are in the unfortunate worst side in history, silent complicity, waiting to see where everything falls before they take a stand if they ever see out of their own privilege to have to. What many don't see is that allowing anyone to serve up a minority group as the big bad boogeyman and source of all of our problems shouldn't be allowed. Well, except here, But that boogeyman is fascism, and that's precisely the thing we need to drop the hate and division and unite and take a stand against. Well, you see how it sort of gets complicated. That's why this checklist exists. Many governments check a box or few. This is a numbers game. One is dangerous, but the higher you score, it's like golf. Conservatives are now 3 for 3. No spoilers, but this ain't looking good. Number 4, supremacy of the military. I don't think I even need to expound on this. America's military spending has always been the bulk of our budget in the modern era, outspending other countries by obscene figures. Those who have threatened that cash cow have lost big. McGovern in 72. America chooses his priorities, and those priorities are blowing places to smithereens and then calling your buddies to come rebuild it. Sounds a lot like the mafia, doesn't it? 4 for 4. And foreseeing the fertile field of fascism before us. 5 is rampant sexism. Dr. Britt recognized in the major examples of fascist regimes, patriarchal, male-dominated, feminine, oppressive social atmospheres are present. America's history of female empowerment speaks for itself. Nixon's claims that his opponent in the 1950 California Senate race, actress Helen Gayagan Douglas, was pink right down to her underwear, was American misogyny on display. In fact, Nixon wasn't even original. He took the line from Douglas's opponent in the Democratic primary, LA Daily News owner Manchester Body, who endorsed Nixon over Douglas in the primary. Because she was a woman, yes, but she was also anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, and anti-corruption. You can call out Tricky Dick's corruption all day long, but when he's making people picture you in your pink panties and painting you as a communist, it's a hard thing to overcome in the 1950s. America's treatment toward and attitude toward women is bad enough, but that narrative of disregard for consent, subjugation of women, and devaluing the woman simply because she's a woman, the entire narrative of feminine weakness and the divine feminine and power of femininity being dick-washed out of history. But this nation, starting and choosing to continue that and then going down the route of forced births and taking away rights, well, here's where we crossed the streams, and now we're 5 for 5 conservatives. 5, five fascist traits, Number 6, and we're not even halfway through, controlled mass media. Rupert Murdoch, Vince McMahon, Donald Trump, thanks to Ronald Reagan's deregulation and the agendas pushed by groups like the NRA, ALEC, and the Conservative Opportunity Society, among so many others. This is another of those both sides arguments because many of the wealthy media owners donate to many different candidates for various reasons, but corrupt conservatives have recklessly pushed for the media the way we have it today, homogenized, corporatized, and owned by 6 companies. 6 of 6. Damn, one more of those and it's going to look really bad. Lucky number 7 on Dr. Britt's little list of fascist characteristics is obsession with national security. Here we go again to build the wall and so much of the racist anti-Muslim rhetoric following 9/11. The policies put in place for travel, data, and what amounts to government and corporate spying on we the people all came from America surrendering our better interests, our rights, our liberties, for the sake that we might be just a little bit safer, and we fell for it every time. Guess who pushed those narratives? Privatized prisons are included here too, you know, pushing the scare that crime is a problem when poverty, opportunity, and oppression is the underlying issue. We're midway through and a perfect 7 of 7, but imperfect. You really want to be an ofer on this list. Let's swing at the back 9, right? Or 7 as it were. It just so happens this is the hole-in-one on the list. Dr. Lawrence Britt cites a key fascist state trait is when religion and government are intertwined. That is not the left, folks. Republicans have surrendered us to 10 commandments on government property and acknowledgement of Bibles as official state books. It's prayer in school and keeping God in the classroom. Every classroom, like it or not. It's the right that pushes for banning books and taking away rights based on Unga Bunga caveman scrawlings. 8 for 8. This is looking like infinity, conservatives. 9, corporate power is protected. Citizens United, Hard Hat Riot, again, GE paying Reagan to be an anti-American government, anti-union propagandist, the demonizing of unions and the infiltration of the mafia. The mafia, after all, is pretty corporate, isn't it? And just as number 9 is checked off for Republicans, our conservative friends must brace for the immediate uppercut hard truth of number 10. They go together. As corporate power is protected, labor power is suppressed. The mere fact that we've been fighting this long for a minimum wage that's just barely livable while we refuse to acknowledge that if American capitalism can't pay a livable wage, American capitalism is a failed business. 10 for 10 if you're still keeping score. I am. I take number 11 personally. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Go read my comments sections. The demonization of education and the lean away from willful ignorance to flat-out prideful ignorance. From making college a debt trap to the mockery and denigration delivered by those who didn't do the work to those who learned the things to solve the problems, America has a weird relationship with excellence. We used to celebrate it, insist on it. In fact, part of why Ronald Reagan never achieved the level of success in Hollywood he always felt entitled to is because he wasn't excellent at anything. And he was in a time when America wanted role models more than action figures. With Reagan, America settled for a has-been B-lister with 0 credentials and a less than basic education. Conservatives made that an icon. George W. Bush, a shadow of his father's eloquence and intellect. America wasn't rising above. Sarah Palin to Donald Trump. Whenever an artist speaks out on an issue, it's just, shut up and art. The left does it with Kid Rock and Ted Nugent too. We aren't immune despite our reasonings and evidence. Rather than America setting standards of excellence for education, we're left with a bare minimum society of know-nothing know-it-alls like Reagan, where potential is almost never achieved. I hope my nose isn't bleeding because this is 11 for 11. Number 12 is America's obsession with crime and punishment. Again, with the death penalty, life sentences, brutal torture, privatized prisons, war on drugs, Nixon's crime and punishment, and everything Reagan. And what about those BLM riots? But when you mention the treasonous Republican insurrection of January 6th, a dirty dozen and not a cracked egg among them. 13. Look, we're far gone now. We shouldn't have come close to a single one of these, but here we are. Rampant cronyism and corruption. This has been the tale of America since America fled the rampant cronyism and corruption of the motherland. In fact, America wasn't just founded on it, it's grown to the extent that it has because of people fleeing lands riddled with rampant cronyism and corruption, coming to the land of opportunity for a better chance. Yeah, spoilers. I know, it didn't start with Nixon and it won't end with Trump selling cabinet seats, but boy, did they just put it right out on the coffee table for everyone to see the minute they came over. Cronyism and corruption is what our government on every level is consumed with. How do you avoid it? Regulations, restrictions, rules, oversight. Conservatives have spent the last century trying desperately to dismantle any and all of that which would hinder their lust for power, prestige, and immeasurable wealth. 13 out of 13, folks. Spoilers for American conservative Republicans, it's 14 of 14 on Dr. Lawrence Britt's 14 characteristics of fascism. Finally, fraudulent elections. As a society teeters closer to fascism, their elections are an all-out sham. Like in 2000 when the candidate's brother had the final say, or in any and every election where redistricting and gerrymandering takes place, or in the case of 2020 when the election was as fair as we can get them, and claims of fair elections being fraudulent because the loser didn't win. Or in 1968 when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated just like his brother was, throwing the entire Democratic primary into chaos, leaving voters vulnerable to Nixon's persuasive rhetoric. Thanks to Rupert Murdoch, mass media coverage of elections in America has changed dramatically to a 24/7 political news cycle for 3.5 years out of a 4-year presidential election cycle. Those other 6 months are heavy political news cycle, just not the mentioning of the upcoming election as much. Voting rights restrictions and laws that are designed to make it harder for citizens to vote in a country where voting is taken for granted by most citizens, creating the ambivalence for voting in the marginalized communities that aren't likely to vote your way. Just for example, smear campaigns are the norm and accepted in a more fascist-leaning society. After all, if we valued intellectualism, we would be having fact-based diplomatic debates based on positive rhetoric of solutions rather than blaming others for our problems like a raw mid-match professional wrestling verbal smackdown. Britt also warns that in fascist regimes, the court systems and judges are manipulated or put in place to specifically influence legislation to sway their way. SCOTUS. America's Suicide by Fascism in 14 parts. Is this a conspiracy? That's up to you. Create one out of this if it helps you deal with what's happened better. How do we come out of this United States of America? How do we avoid the split? A civil war today looks much different than it did over a century and a half ago. The divide is not and never has been over some arbitrary, artificial, imaginary geographical Mason-Dixon line. The divide is deeper between us. What separates us truly as a people, the divide, is between those who are and those who aren't capable of critical thinking, compassion, and humanity. When faced with the greatest and most obvious moral dilemmas of our society, America's consistently, completely ignored the clearly correct answer, but instead sought to fight amongst ourselves to find a way to justify the wrong choice and turn a sweet profit for our close friends and the people who did us the favors to get us here. We saw it before us. We let it happen. And all the while, they were watching, waiting for us to become so weak and vulnerable, we would accept salvation from anywhere that offered it, even if it was the hands of our sworn mortal enemies. The clock is ticking, America. Tick tock. Coming up, We'll wrap it up, getting back on track with this Create Your Own Conspiracy series with a special Part 6, split into 2 parts. And the math's not supposed to make sense. It's a conspiracy. America destroying itself from within through the deliberate recklessness of our trusted representatives in government is one thing. But who saw that going down and fed the beast, hoping to capitalize on our one weakness, our unity, or lack thereof, or the act thereof? Because in America, our unity is just an act. America only rode the unity high from 9/11 for a few days before we were selling our souls for bigotry, fear, and political division. Everyone was watching this reality show and they were taking notes. And we were all online doing the gossipy, tell-all, cutaway confessionals. So, who is behind it all? What I've laid out before you may all be seemingly disconnected events, individuals, and organizations, lots of blah, blah history. However, in the next episode, it will all be more clear and terrifying when I weave it all together with the only thing I'll ask of you outside of a like, share, and a subscribe. Suspend your disbelief for just 1 hour. What I'm going to lay out for you will be the most important warning you're going to receive about what is coming, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, a compassion and critical thinking workbook, is available on Amazon, and you can link to it through joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, and clips of my acting and voiceover work organized in playlists for you, all for your convenience. Check out my merch store, get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. Bumper stickers are online now, and more products coming soon. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. Hey, if you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. It's my full-time job here. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.